Hello everyone, this is Professor Reha here with another Grim Dawn class examination. So, this particular time we're dealing with the Elementalist, which is the combination of the Demolitionist Shaman, and without items, this one is a fairly straightforward build. It really comes down to what specific kind of weaponry you want to use. Since there are some skills, I'm actually going to get this out of the way right off the top, there are some skills from the Shaman that just aren't that overall useful here. The first one, actually, very specifically, would be just the Wendigo Totem. Yes, the Life Steal or the Life Drain essentially is very effective, obviously, but there is no real consistent way of boosting this damage output. It's Vitality and Bleeding. Granted, you can get that out of Devouring Swarm, but this also does not interact in any way with the Demolitionist. There is no exclusive skill that boosts Vitality or Bleeding damage with the Shaman, and obviously Demolitionist doesn't have an exclusive. I mean, you could boost the bleeding here with Primal Bond, but that's still somewhat of a risky proposition. You can still make it work if you decide to go with mixed pets and focus on the physical side of the Demolitionist. This can work, but overall it's not really my favorite way of playing it. But feasibly, yes, you could make that work. It's just there are better ways of going about this. Now, one exception to this rule, despite the whole vitality thing, is Grasping Vines. If you are going with the hybrid pet focus, Grasping Vines works out very well, even though it brings in some vitality decay later on that you won't really be able to interact with the physical and the bleeding damages there. And if you decide to go melee and build some retaliation, this can also be very effective as well. So Grasping Vines still can maintain a good amount of usefulness, especially again if you are going with the Primal Bond pet kind of build. You can really actually have very impressive Grasping Vines, along with some increased lightning damage, get some bleed in there as well. Good old Brute Force is really good for this. We get some bleeding here, we get a little bit of lightning and more bleeding here. Brute Force combined with Primal Bond, you can get Grasping Vines in there, do a nice little Flame Touched and Temper. You have all kinds of options here. Now, when you are working with this combination, it's going to be very rare that you're going to want to be looking to go into Brimstone, in all honesty. Does that mean you never should? No, absolutely not. If you really want Brimstone, go for it. I just almost never find myself building all the way up to Brimstone here. Static Strike still works. Maybe not as much as Savagery. In this combination, Savagery is usually a better pick because it works a little better overall with the build, personally. But if you want to use Fire Strike and you wanted to pull in Searing Might or possibly Searing Strike, Static Strike is about where you would want to cut that off. One skill that is... while we're actually on the subject of skills that you should and should not build, let's actually, a little bit early, talk about the 3 skills that are really worth considering regardless of how you want to play this. And the first one is obviously Stunjacks. You have lightning, you have physical, later on you get internal trauma. It's a beautiful thing. This skill, with this combination, is going to work pretty much regardless of what you do, unless you go into the pet build, and even then, this still works really well because you're still pulling in that physical damage there. So, overall, I find Stunjacks and Full Spread to be very effective additions to pretty much any build I build with this combination. Another really good build, well, personally, Flame Touched, Temper a little bit more on this one, but Flame Touched or Temper both work really well. This increases lightning damage, and if you're going into Stormcaller's pack, that's even more boost to lightning damage, so you can really stack that on. Interestingly enough, though, you really aren't going to be getting a lot of interaction with that cold damage portion, but since Stormcaller's pact is primarily focused on lightning damage anyways, that's okay. But Temper can really work. That also really helps with the Primal Bond as well. You've got the physical and internal trauma. Oh, look, we're increasing physical, pierce, and internal trauma. And I'm actually going to double shout out, actually I should probably highlight these. Both Canister Bomb and Granado, both are very effective in their own way. I personally prefer Granado a little bit more because you again do have that retaliation damage you can really slip in there, but either of these work really well in all honesty. So do keep that in mind. For Shaman, personally, again, Brute Force, regardless of how you build, unless you're really intent on using a single-hand weapon, in which case obviously you can't build this, a lot of people are going to build two-handed weapons, and a lot of the most effective builds for this combination use two-handed weapons, so brute force is generally something you're going to at least want to consider. Same thing with savagery. Excellent ability. This doesn't matter if you're using two-handed or single-handed weapons, although if you're using two-handed, you can get Might of the Bear, which is extremely awesome. And finally, again, Grasping Vines tends to work really well. This is somewhat reliant. If you're going with Stormcaller's Pact, obviously a better build would be Storm Totem, but it is at least worth considering. Another alternative would be Primal Strike, but quite frankly, considering Savagery's effectiveness, I don't often find myself needing or wanting Brute Force, but if you wanted to include it, it is a very strong ability in this, and does work with pretty much everything. Again, you've got bleeding, you've got physical, it does work out really well overall. I just don't find it particularly... It's not so much that I don't like the ability, it's just that I find better ways of doing what it does, which is hitting large groups of enemies. But again, this is totally a matter of your personal preference. But this is also a very strong contender with this combination. Now, if you are going to be going into Stormcaller's Pact, you basically have to ask yourself, hey, am I going to use two-handed or single-handed weapons? In this situation with Stormcaller's Pact, you are going to want to use Savagery, because Fire Strike, when it gets all the way up to Static Strike, is just not going to provide the consistent lightning damage that you want out of your default attacks, so you're going to go into Savagery every time if you're going Stormcaller's Pact. Just unless you have some sort of large group of items that increase Fire Strike, in which case, yes, but that's not very common. So most of the time you're going to be looking at Savagery. Now, whether or not you decide to go into two-handed will decide on whether or not you're going to be going into more Demolitionist or more Shaman. If you are going two-handed, then Brute Force is a great pickup. You can go into Flame Touched here in Temper, and at that particular point, considering these Stun Jacks, probably Granado with the Skyfire Granado, and or Canister Bomb, this is actually another combination where Ulzwin's Chosen works really well, because you can modify all of this great lightning damage, and physical damage, and internal trauma damage, and just absolutely go to town. And in fact, this is one of the combinations where I would say, hey, Ulzwin's Chosen really pulls its weight, and is really potentially strong here if you want to dedicate yourself to that. Now, the only reason why Ulzwin's Chosen isn't a ability that you always want to sit down and consider is it does require a large quantity of point investment, and that can be bothersome. You basically do have to build around the idea of using Ulzwin's Chosen here, and you're basically running for Stormcaller's Pact, Savagery, and Brute Force here, and then leaving the rest of this alone. Skipping over Primal Strike because you have all of these grenades, basically the distance version of that. So you do have that. You also, though, don't limit yourself to this. You have some pretty actually, this would still be useful. Some pretty fantastic options here if you decide to go with Vindictive Flame, Ulzwin's Wrath, go into Blast Shield here, max out Temper, of course. And you can do some pretty fun things. You actually probably still would want to keep Granado because it does pull in the retaliation damage, but you could absolutely do that. That works really well. You can get all of this retaliation damage, some really nice boosts there. That's a fantastic way to go about it. If you wanted to splash into Grasping Vines, well, you could. Although if you were going to do a retaliation damage setup, I actually usually prefer the pet setup here, as just a personal matter, especially since if you're going retaliation, you want the kind of boosts you get from Mogdragon's Pact anyways. This really helps and increases your retaliation damage, obviously, here, but it also keeps you alive long enough to actually, take the damage you need to deal your retaliation damage. Whether or not you use Brute Force is entirely up to you. It really depends for me personally on how many points I have left, but Granado remains useful, Ulzwin's Chosen still, all of these great abilities. So you can do a really interesting and effective retaliation build. You can technically do two different ones, so that's fairly interesting and very enjoyable. But if you are going to go with the pet build and you're not going to go into retaliation damage for whatever reason you happen to have, then I would really lean quite heavily on Canister Bomb in this particular situation. Maybe you pull out stun jacks, maybe you don't. That again really depends on you. You do increase physical and internal trauma, which stun jacks does. You could still do Granado, that does piercing damage, physical and internal trauma. This, though, it does eventually get also internal trauma, pierce. It just doesn't do as much physical, really. It just has a wider area of effect. This does physical and piercing, physical and internal trauma, pierce and fire. It does everything you need. One that you're really going to want to probably keep away from is the mortar trap as well. It does physical, fire, and lightning in pretty much equal amounts, obviously with a slightly greater emphasis on the physical and fire, but there's not enough lightning coming out of heavy ordnance where you can justify building this over something that goes pure lightning like Granado, or pure lightning without any kind of modification like stun jacks and full spread. It's just a much better ability for what it's worth than the mortar trap really is. So do keep that in mind. Another ability you probably won't be looking to use will be the Thermite Mine. The fire and chaos damage is fantastic, don't get me wrong, but there's so much you can do to increase either your physical and or your lightning damage that it's often not worth building something that's pure fire, which is also why you're going to generally want to avoid the Blackwater Cocktail for pretty similar reasons. Now, if you are playing in a multiplayer game and you really want to support your team, you can go with these two, they do support, but for the Shaman, if you're going for team support, first off, if you're going with the physical bleeding, you're already going to be supporting your team with Mogdragon's Pact, because that's going to start... No, excuse me, yeah. I believe this does do an AoE, 12 meter radius. This boosts your allies as well, so just having this on with your bleeding pet-focused build is going to help them anyways, so you're already helping them. But if you're going to go into the non-pet lightning version, build Wind Devil. These scale off of your personal bonuses, and they do lightning, physical, and eventually they start doing cold damage. So, the fact that they do physical as well means Demolitionist is going to come in with Temper again and boost that up as well, if you really want to. But these will reduce enemies' elemental resistance, which helps your allies a lot, and they make a nice distraction for enemies. So if you absolutely must help your allies, and you want to do a Stormcrawler's Pact, you go into Wind Devil. It's not bad, it is really good, even if you're not playing with teams, but it has a little bit more emphasis if you're playing with other people. And Mogdragon's Pact, of course, if you're going with the pets, then Mogdragon's Pact will be enough support, really. You could build some of these other things, you could build a Blackwater Cocktail, you could build Thermite Mine, but these two abilities will always be some of the weakest in your repertoire unless you're specifically focusing on building them up, and in which case, you don't even need to be a shaman in the first place. Let's be really honest here. So, there is that as well. Now, despite all of this, does that mean there's any one particular item you should not build? Absolutely? No. You can, as always, they're just less effective. Like I said with the big one still can work, but you do have to devote a little bit more of your equipment to it. Now, again, equipment changes all of this up fairly smoothly, but this particular combination is pretty close to as straightforward as people generally perceive it to be when they look at the Elementalist. They usually look at it and think, oh, lightning damage, and that's true about half the time. The other half of the time, you're looking at physical, internal trauma, and bleeding, and you're splashing in a couple of pets. Which is fine. It actually can turn out quite well, especially since Flame Touched and Temper also boosts everyone in an area around you, which is yet another benefit for any allies you may have, and also for your pets. So, there is that benefit there. So you have all kinds of different options. If you wanted to make a build inspired by Ulzuin's Chosen, this is the build to do. This is not the build. This is the class to do it with. Let me use the proper term there. This is the class you're going to want to do it with, because you can massively boost the damage output of all three of the abilities that Ulzuin's Chosen enhances. You can enhance their physical and internal trauma damage. You can enhance their pierce damage, their lightning damage. Doesn't matter. Does not matter. Frankly, you can build all three of these, regardless of which way you're eventually going with Shaman, in all honesty. It just hits a little harder under Stormcrawler's Pact. Usually. But overall, there's not much else you can say about this combination without starting to talk about items, and I want to kind of talk about items pretty individually by themselves. I'll probably do a separate series on this where I'll showcase some item and say, well, if you wanted to do a focused build, I'll, play it this way. Or I offer these suggestions to you. But overall, that is what we're really talking about with the Elementalist. There's essentially three broad ways you can play this. I would say three would be the best descriptor. Three broad ways you can play this. Technically four. You can play Stormcaller's Pact without Retaliation. You can play Stormcaller's Pact with Retaliation. You can play Primal Bond with or without Retaliation. If you decide to go with single-hand weapons, this really just is a question of do you have the option for brute force or not. If you decide not to use brute force, regardless of whether or not you have a two-handed weapon, that's fine. But the Elementalist is geared much more towards two-handed weapons. If you are using single-hand weapons for any reason, especially melee, I would at least more strongly consider Fire Strike. So that way, at the very least, you can get your hands on Searing Strike if you're using melee. If you're not using melee, then you get the nice AoE from Explosive Strike. But then it's not that great. If you're using single-hand melee, this has some strong contention. Like I said, if you really want to use a pistol and go up to Explosive Strike, that's fine. It can work. It's just a little bit interesting. Again, this is somewhat subjective to the items you have on hand at the time. So that's all I'm really going to say about the Elementalist class here. There's not a whole lot to say about this combination because it's pretty straightforward. There is some deviation that not a lot of people think about, but mostly it's a matter of just making sure you're not wandering into the Devouring Swarm or Wendigo Totem, which are about the only two skills that you can't really effectively use here. I would also personally stay away from Thermite Mine and Blackwater Cocktail in this combination, and of course the explosives are always good. Flame Touch Temper, and Savagery. Brute Force, if you are using two-handed. With that being said, thank you all very much for joining me, thank you all very much for listening, and if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, or suggestions, please leave them down in the comments below, and thank you all very much. Have a great 24 hours.